I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day, well actually there is no question of the day today because I thought we'd do something a little bit different in light of the fact that there is now less than 1 week to go until Christmas Day. That's right, December the 25th, 2018 is almost upon us. And because we're in the Christmas season, this is the time of year when people like to propagate the usual Christmas myths, the historical inaccuracies and the unscholarly falsehoods about Christmas. For example, people like to say things like Jesus never existed, or the pagan god Mithras was actually stolen and rebranded as Jesus by the Christians. That's just two of the typical Christmas myths that you hear at this time of year. So I thought on today's episode, we would actually debunk a whole lot of those typical Christmas myths. And to do that, I thought we'd get someone special on. And so earlier, I interviewed Dr. Glynn Peoples. Glynn is a really awesome local Kiwi PhD. He knows his stuff. And so we spoke a little bit earlier on Skype. And here for your viewing pleasure, let the debunking begin. Glynn, thanks for being with us here today. Tell me a little bit about yourself before we get started so that the listeners know that you are not just some tinfoil wearing internet hack who's just plucking theories out of thin air. Tell us a bit about your qualifications.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I was going to say, I'm just some guy with an internet connection. but okay, so I suppose I have a bit of an academic background. I did my divinity degree at what was the Bible College of New Zealand. And then I went down to Dunedin and did my master's degree in theology and a PhD in philosophy looking at religion in the public square. And just since then, I've occasionally published and speak on subjects in theology, in New Testament, and in philosophy.
Glynn, you also have a blog, is that right?
I do, yes. It's called Right Reason at rightreason.org, where I talk about all manner of things within the domain of my studies, from philosophy of religion to New Testament exegesis and theology and everything in between.
And one last thing, you are making guitars, right? You still making guitars?
I do build guitars, yeah. That's kind of been put on hold because we moved house and I'm setting up the workshop and so on. But yeah, I'll be back into that shortly, and that's loads of fun. Very therapeutic.
Okay, folks, so if you want to check out Glynn, go to rightreason.org. And don't bother telling him to go to hell because he's an annihilationist, so that doesn't work. But it's a really good blog. I'd highly recommend it if you're looking to engage with Christian theology, philosophy, and some of the things that we talk about on this channel as well, when we're not talking about Star Wars. So, Glynn, let's get into the topic at hand. The Christmas season is a time for holly jolly cheer and also often new atheist grinchery with all sorts of myths that start popping up about Jesus and about Christmas and those dirty filthy Christians just stealing all that pagan mythology. So let's start at the very beginning. The grandpappy of all the myths, did Jesus actually exist or was he just a fictional invention?
Yeah, interesting. People go on the internet and discover that Jesus didn't exist. Look, it'll be no surprise what I'll say. Yes, Jesus existed. Now, obviously, people, pretty much anyone who's not a Christian, will be skeptical about what the New Testament says about what Jesus did. That's to be understood. But it takes a truly radical skeptic to deny that this man actually existed, to the point where I think it's safe to say that sort of denial is not even within the bounds of respectable historiography. It's just silly. Not that some people don't say it, but very few. So you've got things like the sudden rise of the Christian movement in the early to mid 1st century, with key figures who wrote of their experiences with Jesus in the New Testament. And people will say, well, they were believers. Well, yes, they were, but so are most people who met Abraham Lincoln and had anything to say about him. I mean, that's but beyond that, I mean, you have the type of evidence that you would expect from someone who was actually quite a minor figure in his own time. We think of him as famous now, but he wasn't famous in the 1st century. And so for someone of that profile, we have the kind of evidence that we would expect and more. So we have, say, the records of the 1st century Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus or Tacitus, and some more minor sources. So our historical evidence just for the existence of Jesus, which is a very low bar, is easily as good as our historical evidence for the existence of any well-established historical person.
Now, let's just clarify something here, because those two sources you referred to, they're not Christians, are they? So they've got no skin in the game.
Oh, no, Tacitus didn't like Christians at all. He was writing about them just to explain that they were these vermin who had still survived to his own day, and he didn't like that. So, no, they weren't Christians.
Yeah, for me, whenever I hear this one, I think of flat earth science, basically, because you have some very reputable atheist scholars who would scoff at that kind of myth, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the better known... I guess you can call him a skeptic. Better known skeptics in terms of New Testament studies is Bart Ehrman, who is not a Christian. He's I wouldn't say that he's an outright atheist. He describes himself as agnostic, but is not a believer in the deity of Jesus, and he doesn't believe that the New Testament is true. But he takes fringe atheists to task for saying things like Jesus doesn't exist. He says, look, people are not going to take atheists seriously if you go around saying silly things like that. Okay, then let's move on down the list. Sol Invictus. This is another big one you hear. This time of year, everyone trots out Sol Invictus. First of all, before we get into the myth, what exactly is Sol Invictus? Okay, so Sol Invictus is the name of a Roman god, at least in the later years of the Roman Empire. The name, most of us are familiar with Sol meaning sun. Sol Invictus means unconquered sun. So he was this indomitable deity figure, and this god was a patron of Roman soldiers, presumably with the idea that they too would be unconquered if they fought under Sol Invictus.
And so there's an associated memorial celebration festival associated with Sol Invictus, like with a lot of Roman gods. Is that right?
There is, yes, and the typical trope is to say, well, it was a festival of Sol Invictus on the 25th of December. And then really that was the basis of the historical celebration of Christmas. It wasn't anything to do with the birth of Jesus. It just arose from this pagan festivity. It was a theory that was bandied about briefly in the 19th century when there was a real drive to explain Christian belief with reference to myth. There isn't really any scholarly support for it, though. But like a number of theories in that category, there is the internet where the miracle of resurrection occurs and bad ideas come back to life. So it has kind of gained a new life on the internet in the form of memes where they say something like paganism is the reason for the season. It's passed around by so-called skeptics. I think they should be a bit more skeptical of the debunked stories that they pass on. So the story that you'll probably hear is that pagan Romans were merely celebrating a festival all about Sol Invictus on 25th of December. The Christians just co-opted this date, and either that was the real origin of Christmas, or what the Christians were doing was deliberately co-opting it so they could take away the significance from Sol Invictus, which kind of makes sense. But it didn't really happen that way. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you might read in a Dan Brown novel. I don't think he did. I don't think he used that particular one, but it's that kind of story. Real history is often a little bit more boring than that. So Emperor Aurelian made Sol Invictus an official cult of the Roman Empire towards the end of the 3rd century, about AD 274. But he didn't choose 25th of December as a feast day. There was no significance attributed to that day at all. In fact, there's an inscription from the early 4th century, so a little while after this festival was set up, and it made reference to a special day for making offerings to Sol Invictus. But that was in the middle of November. So again, nothing to do with December. And just over a decade later, after that inscription, we've got the first written record of Orthodox Christians celebrating Christmas on December 25th. So that was the same time where Sol Invictus was associated with a different day altogether. And there's evidence that they'd been doing it even earlier than that. There was a Christian sect called the Donatists. They were Christians in the broad sense, but they had some funky beliefs going on. But one of the things that they were famous for is being really, really strict. And one of the things that they were strict about is not allowing outside pagan influences to influence the church. They wanted to be really, truly pure. And so they didn't, for example, celebrate Epiphany because they thought that was a novelty. But they did celebrate the birth of Christ on the 25th of December, which makes you think, hang on. So if even these ultra purists who wouldn't accept any outside influences were doing it on that day, there's possibly something to it. And that was sort of early 3rd century. So this is definitely before Sol Invictus was even adopted as an imperial cult.
So then tell me, where does this myth come from? Is this just someone who says, okay, son God, son of God, the Christians call Jesus? Is it literally that simplistic? Where do we get this from?
It's kind of that dumb at some level. I mean, some people have seen the online movie Zeitgeist, where there's all these conspiracy theories about lots of different things, but one of them is about how Christianity arose and why Jesus is so popular. And he plays on that word game so often, saying these people worship the Son God, Son of God, or the sun god, as in the god of the sun up in the sky. And you have to think, I mean, this guy realizes these people weren't speaking English right. These words didn't sound the same centuries ago. So responsible historians have had to respond to this just because it became a thing. And so there's a historian named Stephen Ernst Heijmans, and he shows that no one ever associated Sol Invictus with the 25th of December until the second half of the 4th century. So if there was any influence going on here, it was the Christian tradition that influenced the Romans and not the other way around, which is interesting because you typically hear the myth the other way. But this idea that Christians took Christmas from Sol Invictus is not really a serious position. It's just a meme, really.
Okay, let's move on down then to Mithras. Rhymes with myth. So Mithras, this is one of the really popular ones you see popping up from time to time. The idea that Christians just stole the god Mithras, the pagan god Mithras, and relabeled him Jesus for their new religion.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Well, no. I mean, it helps too that Mithras sounds like Christmas. I actually wrote a blog about this one called Merry Mithras. It's the kind of thing, yes, if you Google it, you'll find lots of hits because it's kind of popular on the internet, but it's not popular in scholarship. There was a Persian god named Mithra, and later there was a Roman god named Mithras. Possibly one became the other. People aren't really sure about that. But the Roman religion of Mithras began in the late 1st century, shortly after Christianity, and was regarded by some of the church fathers and some historians as an early rival to the Christian faith. So, they didn't get along well, as you might expect. I mean, it's another god. But the claims that some people make about Mithraism today, that's the name of the following, are just silly. And as I read, I say that as though it's just an insult, but honestly, if you read them and the way that people treat them, it's as though there's this mindset that you can just make up almost anything on the internet and get away with it. Well, kind of get away with it. There will be people who will believe you. So you get things like the movie I referenced earlier, the Zeitgeist, or various websites that'll say, Mithras, according to the stories about him, was born of a virgin on the 25th of December, born in a stable with shepherds. He had 12 disciples. He was killed, then buried in a tomb, and then rose again 3 days later. And you hear that and you think, actually, that's quite impressive. That's a lot of similarity. And if that were true, then it would be really interesting. But it's not. I mean, none of those things are true. I mean, I want to say none of those things happened. I mean, I think it was a myth anyway. But even in the myth, not one of those things happened. So according to Mithraic belief, Mithras was not born of a virgin. He was born out of a rock. And it wasn't on December 25th. There was no significance associated with that day when the religion arose. It wasn't in a stable. It was in a cave. There were no shepherds present. They were torchbearers who helped Mithras out of the rock. They were kind of like midwives in the story. He didn't have 12 disciples. That's just not part of the stories. He was never even killed, let alone buried in a tomb. And since he never died, he didn't rise from the dead. I mean, what he did was he slayed this great bull and put on a feast for the sun god Sol. But I mean, there is no truth to the things that people say about Mithras, and yet people shared this kind of thing online, like cocaine, or not that you share that, but like a doobie at a libertarian party, without spending any time fact checking. And you look at this and you think, people think they can get away with anything.
Okay, Osiris. Next cab off the rank. Is Jesus just a repackaging of Osiris?
Yeah, I mean, not yeah, but no. I mean, it's kind of more of the same. And this is how, I mean, the way you're sort of saying, what about this God and what about this God? That's kind of how some conversations go. Someone will say that Jesus was just a copy of a particular pagan god. They offer no sources, no credible evidence. And then you take, so they've invested no effort. You invest your time and effort explaining in detail why that's not true. And instead of backing off and saying, okay, maybe this is a subject area I don't really know anything about, they'll just come right back and take a swing with a different god, knowing just as little about this one as they did with the last one. And so they'll say, oh, it's not a copy of Mithras? Well, what about Dionysius? What about Apollonius? What about Osiris? You're like, no, stop. You're making the same mistakes every time. So just really briefly, there were a couple of sensationalist books that claimed that Jesus was just a recurring God-man theme in the ancient world, who had appeared elsewhere as a figure like Mithras, or this one, the Egyptian deity Osiris. Now, just like with Mithras, you've got these claims that the life of Osiris is very similar to the life of Jesus. And so it's said that in the stories he was born of a woman, through the union of human divine. He was unjustly persecuted. He was betrayed by a dinner guest, killed on a wooden object. His body was wrapped by women and anointed with oil. He was laid in a tomb. Strange signs happened when he died, and then they were both resurrected, Jesus and Osiris. Shortly after that, they returned to heaven, which again sounds kind of interesting at first, until you stop reading anti-Christian conspiracy theorists and start reading qualified Egyptologists who aren't trying to convince you that Jesus is a copy. They're just trying to tell you about Osiris, right? Because those are the sources you should use, right? So just read the Egyptologists and you'll find out that these parallels don't really exist. So Osiris was not born of a virgin or even a human. His mother was the goddess Nut. So he was simply a divine being who was born of gods. And the legends don't say that Osiris became human. Now, in the story of Osiris, someone else invited them to go to dinner with them, and they were trying to trap him, which is not really the same as what happened in the case of Jesus at the Passover. That's not the way it played out. So Osiris, in one version of the story, is locked in a coffin and then thrown into the Nile. And people kind of get around that by saying, try and draw a parallel. Well, they're both killed on wooden objects. Yeah, but that's really not the same. There's no resemblance there. He's basically drowned in the river. So it's nothing like crucifixion. And after being drowned, the body of Osiris was said to be torn into 14 pieces so that his wife Isis wouldn't find and reunite them. And some versions say that she did reunite them, but in all of the versions of the story, he's not raised back to life again. That doesn't happen. When people talk about Osiris, quote-unquote, resurrection, all they're really talking about is his spiritual survival in the underworld, and it's sort of a disembodied, like a ghost, which is what, a lot of people in the ancient world believe that, but no one ever confused that for resurrection. They're not the same thing at all. Resurrection is where a dead person comes out of the ground, right? Daniel 12:2 talks about, people who sleep in the dust waking up. That's resurrection. So as soon as you put even the slightest bit of effort into research the claims about these parallels between Osiris and Jesus, you realize, hang on, this is just a recurring theme. None of these stories are true. None of these stories about similarities are really true at all.
So effectively the moral of the story is, if you're going to be a skeptic, you need to go full skeptic and actually be certain of what it is that you are claiming to be fact and not, right?
Yeah, they're not skeptics. They're just latching on to attractive stories.
Yeah. Like you say, it suits the narrative, as they would say, in the modern media game, right?
That's right.
Now, okay, so let's talk about pagan solstice connections, the whole idea of Yule and the Yuletide, etc. You commonly hear people saying this, stealing other pagan festivals. What's the deal there? Yeah,
and this one is actually a little bit more interesting because there is at least some degree of truth to it when it comes to the whole Yule thing. I mean, we do talk about Christmas as Yuletide. So things are a bit mixed because it is quite true that Yule was a European winter festival with pagan associations, especially with the god Odin, as he led the wild hunt across the sky. It's kind of cool. Not true, but kind of cool. Yeah. But Yule is of Germanic origin. And the reasons that Christians celebrate Christmas in December, which we'll say a bit about soon, they come from the likes of Hippolytus of Rome and Tertullian of Carthage in Africa. So we're not talking about celebrations with a common origin. And the date isn't exactly the same either. It's just it's a similar time of year. But because that time of year in Europe was associated with Yule, was called Yuletide. It was kind of natural to describe Christmas as happening during Yuletide because it did, which gave rise to the term Christmastide. But that doesn't explain the origin of Christmas. It only explains some of its historical development as a social festival. And even there, it's tempting to exaggerate the similarities. So, for example, you might hear people say that a Christmas tree is really just a Yule log. That's a bridge too far, and people do this. I mean, if you know what a Yule log is, it was a tree that you would cut down, and you'd take the whole log home and into your house, and you'd put one end into the fire with the rest of the log hanging out, and you'd gradually move the log into the fire as it burned, and so you'd be warm throughout Yuletide. But the first recorded example of people decorating a tree for Christmas and displaying it inside, that wasn't until the Renaissance in the 16th century, when Martin Luther and German Protestants put candles in evergreen trees as a Christmas decoration. Now, interestingly, some Christians, most notably Catholics, Brendan, were resistant to that practice, but not because it had anything to do with Yule. It didn't. It's because they didn't like Martin Luther. And bear in mind, too, when we talk about things like Christmas trees, we're not talking about the way that Christianity, i.e. the church, celebrates Christmas. We're talking about the way that secular culture celebrates Christmas. And there's nothing wrong with it. But yeah, it can certainly go some way to explain why we do it just the way we do.
And also, if you were to go to, say, I don't know, Africa or parts of the Middle East and start talking about Yuletide, a lot of people would just be scratching their heads, right?
That's exactly right.
If you talked about Christmas, they'd go, oh, I know what that is.
Yeah. Yuletide makes sense in Australasia and in North America because we're from Europe. I mean, culturally, that's where those things come from.
Okay, then this is the big question then that probably everyone's now asking. If Christians didn't steal this date and didn't reinvent this Jesus fella from other gods, then where did Christianity get the date for Christmas from? Where does that come from?
Well, it's kind of weird, actually. I mean, Christians decided on the 25th of December for what I think are unusual reasons. So there was a writer named Hippolytus of Rome, so-called because he lived in Rome. He lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and he had this idea that there was an exact number of years, a precise whole number of years between creation and other events like the Babylonian captivity, but also between creation and the conception of Christ, which is the Annunciation, when when the angel said to Mary, "You're going to have a baby," and then a whole number of years between Christ's conception and death, meaning that they would have occurred on the same day of the year because there are an exact number of years, a whole number of years apart. And another theologian, Tertullian, had placed the death of Christ on the 25th of March. I'm not certain of why he did that, but that's when he thought it happened. And so if you buy into Hippolytus' idea about the space between Jesus' conception and death being an exact number of years, that meant that Jesus was conceived on the 25th of March, meaning that his birth would be 9 months later than that, on the 25th of December. It's a bit odd, but now I'm not saying that, yes, Jesus was born on the 25th of December. The truth is I don't buy at all Hippolytus' claim about the span of time between creation and Jesus' conception and death. And honestly, when it comes to Tertullian, who knows if he's right about when Jesus was crucified. But however wrong we think that method of determining the date for Christmas might be, that's how they did it. It had nothing to do with Sol Invictus or any other ancient deity. Yeah, and it's really, if you understand the liturgical nature of Christianity, right, it kind of all of this starts to make sense. That there is in actual fact, often people think of Christmas as the pinnacle point for Christianity. It's not. Easter is. No,
Easter is the most important festival, and yep. Everything is built around that liturgical calendar. And so there is a certain logic, if you like, to the way things are done, even if they didn't necessarily get the dates correct at the beginning, right? That's right. It's the creation of a routine, even if the routine is based on errors. It's still the routine that we use. Well, I guess the moral of the story is, folks, do your research. Don't, and especially if you hear other people passing around the typical Christmas memes, don't be afraid to mix it up in the comment section and point them in the direction of this video. Glynn, I guess just one last question, thinking about this topic in general. Is there recommended reading that people can do? Even those who might be watching today who are a little bit more skeptical and say, oh, I don't know, is this guy really telling the truth? Where do they go? What do they recommend? What do you recommend they read? Well, having just spent a little bit of time bashing the internet,
honestly, if you are actually interested in finding out historical resources, the internet is a wonderful place to be. Because if you go to a website like www.christianityisbs.com, you're probably not going to find anything useful. But if you go to something like Early Christian Archives or something that seems like an actual credible source, you'll probably find out quite a lot. But just in terms of a good presentation of the Christian case for why we do Christmas the way we do, is actually I would consider it to be an entry-level apologetics book by Lee Strobel called The Case for Christmas. And it just sets out in a really simple way why there is good historical reason to believe that Jesus existed and that Christmas is in fact a celebration of his birth.
Can I also recommend, I don't know if you've seen the site, but History for Atheists.
I have, yes.
And that's written by an atheist scholar. Yeah. And his blog is set up to debunk in a very detailed scholarly way a lot of these absurd new atheist claims. And a lot of the stuff that happens, literally, something you might have seen Sam Harris say last week, he's responding to a week or two later, so it's that quick. And it's well worth reading, right?
Yeah, and it's really good that there are actually people out there policing this stuff. Just like we need Christians who are saying, look, don't listen to that crackpot. You need atheists doing the same. Yeah,
awesome. Glynn, thanks for being with us here today. Again, how do people follow you and read what you're writing or any of the other stuff that you're putting online? How do they track you down?
Well, don't follow me. Follow the one I follow.
Well said.
rightreason.org is my website. That's probably the best way to find me if you want to.
Awesome. And I guess we probably both agree, if you're wondering what this is all about and you've never been, get yourself along to a midnight mass for Christmas this year and check it out, or find out what your local church service is offering and head on down there, and you might be surprised to discover just how interesting it all is.
Absolutely. I tell that to everyone every year. Even if I'm one of my guitar making videos, I'll say, go to church for Christmas this year. You don't know what you're missing.
Awesome. Glynn, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure. Take care.
See you, mate. Thanks for watching. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. There's links to do that in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.